Hello and welcome to the University of Calgary webinar, Microbiome, Why a Few Trillion Germs Can Be a Good Thing. My name is Jennifer Alford and I'll be your moderator today. We're going to meet our scholars in just a minute, but first I want to give you a little bit of information about what we're doing today and how everything works. These webinars feature a series of University of Calgary scholars who bring us a summary of their research. Now we invite you to ask questions throughout the webinar. Just type it in that little screen to the left of the slide, and we hope to get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. And as we go along, you'll see some more resources that we have on this topic. If you look to the right of your screen, you'll see something called the resource list. Now the resource list has links to an article on this topic, to an ebook on this topic, and also to a website on a book on this topic called Let Them Eat Dirt. So all the parents out there wondering about the microbiome and kids, you're going to want to check out that book. If you're on Twitter, we ask you to keep the conversation going with the hashtag #ExploreUCalgary. And finally, we would really like your feedback. So we have a little quick feedback survey at the end where you can just tell us what you think. You'll find that on the right of your screen as well. Now, to our scholars. Paul Kubes is a professor in the Cumming School of Medicine and the founding director of the Snyder Institute for Chronic Diseases. Welcome. And Kathy McCoy, there she is a professor in the Cumming School of Medicine and the founding director of the Western Canadian Microbiome Centre here at the University of Calgary. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Now, Paul, I understand you are going to start us off today.
I will. So thank you for joining us. I thought I would start by saying that in the 1960s, politicians decided that the war on infections was over. There was no need to worry anymore. We had antibiotics. And of course, as you watch media over the last few years, nothing could be further from the truth. We're still at war. This is a picture from the Ebola outbreak in Africa, and obviously this was a devastating problem. In addition to that, you can see, for example, that not just viruses, but also bacteria causes tremendous grief, and there are superbugs. There are bugs that have developed a resistance to antibiotics that we're using. So bugs will spit out the antibiotics. They no longer die from the antibiotics, and we've got a real problem. And this has really captured the imagination of media. In addition to that, though, we have an immune system, and that immune system allows us to fight right back. And so this is the policeman of the immune system, the neutrophil. Its job is to kill bacteria, and it is very, very efficient at that. And so clearly, from these first few slides, you would conclude that all bacteria are bad. They need to all be killed so that we can live a nice, healthy life. And I think that nothing could be further from the truth. If you actually think about it, many bacteria actually live with us from day to day. And so there are many bacteria that neutrophils ignore, they don't kill, that really are minding their own business. And in fact, this is what we call the microbiome, the bacteria that live everywhere throughout our body, on our skin. And so, for example, not sure you knew, but we have about 600 different species of bacteria living in our lungs. We've got about 1,000 different species on your skin. You've got another 500 to 1,000 species in your intestine. And so there's probably at least as many bacteria as there are cells of your own in the human body.
Wow.
And these bacteria have been living with us since the beginning of time. I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about the microbiome. So just very quickly, what is a microbe? So a microbe is just a microscopic organism, something that is too small to see, usually a one-cell organism. And it's made up, and it's actually many different organisms. So the microbiota is all the different community of microbes that live with you. The microbiome actually refers to all the genes that make up the microbial communities. And then a microbe doesn't just have to be a bacterium, but for the most part, when we talk about the microbiome, we think about bacteria. And so you've heard about many of them, staph, streptococcus, E. coli, but there's also fungi, There's also viruses. There's even amoeba. And I just thought I'd run through each of these so that we're all on the same page. So, for example, there are many species of E. coli that live inside your intestines that seem to cause no harm at all. But if you get the wrong kind of E. coli, you can get hamburger disease, and you can actually get very, very sick. We can also look at fungi, and so most of the fungi in your intestine are actually in the small intestine. They're sort of in a yeast-like form, not necessarily in a hyphae-like form, but there are different kinds of fungi that actually are inside our intestines. And then, in addition to that, there are viruses. And some are with us all the time. We have many different bacteriophage that actually invade bacteria. They can actually regulate how many bacteria are in our intestines. Then there are bugs like rhinovirus, which causes common cold, so you get that every so often. And then there's HIV, which is actually a devastating virus which probably doesn't live with us normally. And finally, you can also, in about 10% of the population globally, you can find certain amoeba that actually also persist in the intestine. This is more of a pathologic situation. So when we're first born, okay, you get the bacteria that are in your mom's birth canal, okay? And this has evolved over many years, and you get the right bacteria. Then you start crawling around, licking the rug, doing all kinds of bizarre things, and this gets you a whole lot more bacteria. And so as you get older, your microbiome increases in diversity. And Kathy will talk a lot more about that. Then you venture off to kindergarten, and you interact with all your other friends, and you share microbiomes with them. You share microbiomes with pets and all kinds of other organisms, and eventually, as you grow up, you end up with a very, very diverse microbiome. And it's kind of cool because, for example, your left hand, which does different things than your right hand, probably has 2 different microbiomes.
Wow.
So if you're right-handed, you probably reach out a lot more and touch a lot more things with your right hand. You probably have more bacteria on that hand. And of course, we now know that we all have this surrounding unique microbiome. Something very interesting, maybe one day you'll walk into a room and you'll commit a crime, and we'll know that you were in that room because of your particular microbiome. That's many years from now, but nonetheless, it's a possibility. And so it's really true that we all actually look a lot more like Pigpen than we do like Charlie Brown. We actually have a microbiome constantly around us.
And with a big smile on your face too, right? The
That's
microbiome's
right.
a good thing.
The microbiome's a good thing. And in fact, the closest microbiome that you share is probably with your spouse or with the people you live with, because you do many of the same things, you eat the same kind of foods, so you probably share a microbiome. And this is important because if you needed to correct your microbiome, there is a source that lives with you that might be able to provide you with a healthy microbiome.
So kind of like a kidney transplant, but just a scoop of microbiome.
Just a scoop of microbiome. Now, when you're born, obviously you are bombarded by all the bacteria that live around you. And so obviously, if you're born through the normal birth canal route, you get a certain microbiome. If you're born through a C-section, a cesarean section, you're most likely to get your doctor's microbiome, the skin microbiome from that doctor or the nurse or whoever handles you. So you end up with a very different beginning than someone who's actually born the natural way. If you're born at home, you might get a very different microbiome than if you're born in the hospital, where the microbiome may or may not be as good for you. And finally, of course, things like breast milk versus formula. Breast milk has many things that we actually know can regulate the microbiome. Obviously, our diets are important because we feed our microbiome. It eats in our intestine. It helps us provide nutrients. It helps us provide vitamins. And so if you eat the right kinds of foods, then your microbiome can actually help to keep you very healthy. Obviously, these two different foods will generate two very different microbiomes. So you can see that our microbiome is affected by how we're born, where we're born, how we live, how we eat. And I want to switch gears now and present you with a real problem. And the problem is the following. In about 1990, suddenly chronic diseases started increasing, okay? And over 30 years, they almost doubled. That cannot be explained by our genetics alone. So we are doing something that's changed the course of disease. And if I show you different diseases, you can see here at around 1990, the incidence of inflammatory bowel disease, so ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, all started going up quite significantly. If we think about things like obesity, for example, okay, again, at around 1990, things started progressing in a disproportionate way. If we look at things like environmental diseases like asthma, for example, and various other problems, allergies, eczema, hay fevers, every one of them around 1990 started increasing, okay? And finally, I've got one last case of diabetes here. Again, somewhere between 1990 and 1995, all of these chronic inflammatory diseases started increasing. Now, what's the difference? Well, this was me as a little boy, okay? Hopefully the one on the left, not on the right. But we used to get dirty. We used to go out and play. We used to do lots and lots of different things. My kids, well, we worry about them, and so they remain very, very, very clean, okay? And you have to ask, is this the best thing for our kids? We used to, many years ago, have all kinds of infections that we were exposed to, including things like tapeworm. And we've evolved an immune system to try and deal with all these different things. You can imagine now that we don't have many of these infections, our immune system might be quite bored. And this is called the hygiene hypothesis. Are we too clean?
And that's something that may have started around 1990, we think?
Well, let me go to the next slide. Okay. Somewhere between 1960, 1970, about 50 years ago, we dropped an atomic bomb on our health. We basically started using antibiotics in a very, very cavalier way. And so anytime somebody got a little sick, if it looked like an infection, antibiotics were prescribed. And so things like little kids getting antibiotics every time they have a sniffle, it's parents being very concerned. But if the child has a virus, antibiotics won't work. And so giving your child antibiotics for the sniffles could potentially be detrimental to the rest of the microbiome. For some time, moms were taking antibiotics, even during pregnancy. And this can modify many things in mom and lead to effects on the newborn. In fact, many, many chronic diseases have actually been associated with changes in the microbiome. Obviously, all kinds of skin diseases, eczema, all kinds of allergies, but also things like brain diseases. So imagine you're probably thinking, hold on, my bacteria can't possibly go up to my brain, so how could this possibly be? Well, the bacteria in your gut are constantly releasing molecules. If you have a particular bacterium where a molecule is released that goes to the brain and makes you misfire some neurons, you could end up with things like autism. You could end up with things like depression, anxiety. And so investigators these days are wondering whether some of these neural diseases that also have started increasing are perhaps linked to the microbiome.
That's quite the list. I mean, that's an exhaustive list, eh?
Autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, inflammatory bowel disease. We already know there are certain bugs, pathogens, bacteria we didn't know about for a long time that are actually causing, for example, gastric ulcers. So H. pylori gastric ulcers are treated now with antibiotics. We have a dilemma here, right? And then, of course, there's all kinds of additional problems, cardiovascular problems, atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, malnutrition. If you don't have the right microbiome, you don't absorb the right foods, the right nutrients, obesity, diabetes. All of these things have been linked to an unhealthy microbiome. Now look, there are times and a place for antibiotics. And if you're a premature baby, your chances of getting infection because your immune system isn't ready are much more likely. And in this case, you need to deliver antibiotics, okay? But now we're thinking maybe after the antibiotics are finished, maybe we can reset the microbiome. Maybe there's ways to reset the microbiome so that you have a healthy microbiome. And so this is why it's so important to study the microbiome. We have to understand what is a healthy microbiome, what is an unhealthy microbiome, and how might we be able to tweak things so that we are dealing with a proper, healthy microbiome.
Does someone's asking a question, does one course of antibiotics, just one course, can that alter the microbiome?
Well, so look, if it's a broad spectrum antibiotic and it kills and wipes out a good chunk of your microbiota, it does set you up potentially for other bacteria coming in and having a niche to live in. So yes, a course of antibiotics can affect your microbiome. Long term, obviously, it's going to have a much more profound impact than just one course. And with one course, I'm hearing that family docs are now starting to think about at least telling you to take some probiotics afterwards. So there is that possibility that you can skew your microbiome just with a single course.
Wow. And we have one more question, Kathy. I think you're going to talk about this more in a minute, but someone's asking if a child is born not through through cesarean, is there a way to get the mother's microbiome onto that child?
So, do you want to take that, Kathy?
Yeah. So there's an idea now, it's already is being practiced in some countries, of actually taking the mom's fecal or vaginal microbiome and actually putting it onto the skin or the face of the newborn baby, and then trying to track if that helps to start that newborn baby with the microbiome. And there's going to be more and more studies in that in the future to see if that's going to help really start that in the right direction.
Interesting.
So my takeaway message is not all bacteria are bad. Sure, there are some, and we do need to use antibiotics sometimes. But I had a cold that I woke up with this morning, and I'm not running off to the doctor to get a treatment for antibiotics. And I think that we've got to be a little bit more careful about how we use antibiotics. There's a new organ. It's called the microbiome. We didn't really pay much attention to it until we realized that we might be damaging it. And so I think that that's very important to keep in mind. And I think that affecting the microbiome, we're now starting to learn, can really affect health.
Interesting. One more question before we move on. Someone's asking if the probiotics that you buy in the store, are those the ones you would suggest after a course of antibiotics? Do they work?
So let me just say that I'm mesmerized by the number of different probiotics that are out there. And as you walk down the aisle of Safeway these days, there's many different varieties to choose from. I would argue that they're the best we've got right now. But I would argue that the real science is not validated, most of them, if any. I think that we need to do the research to figure out what is the magic bullet that will allow us to reset the microbiome, and that's what we're trying to do within our institute, is to figure out what is the best pill to take, and then be able to provide a proper probiotic.
And then you'll know what kind of yogurt to buy as well, right? Because every other yogurt seems to be marketing probiotics.
Absolutely.
Yeah, wonderful.
And I can add to that. And the pill or the best probiotic is probably going to be different depending on the situation and the time of life and the antibiotics you took.
Very good.
Kathy?
Okay, so I want to go through and maybe give you a little bit more detail into the research that's been going on. And just to remind you again that you really can no longer think of yourself as just a human being. You have to think of yourself as a true superorganism, because once you're born, you always have this microbiome with you. They're really your partners in life. So we're a true superorganism. And all mucosal surfaces are home to bacteria. So this is the skin, it's the lung, but the gut, and the different types of bacteria that's going to be there, and the diversity is going to differ depending on where you look. The bacteria that live in your skin are not the same that live in your gut. It's a different environment. They have different food and different amounts of air. And so one pill or one solution is not going to work for everything. We have to think about the niche that the bacteria live in. And the other thing is the intestine is actually a really preferred site for microbial colonization. And it's incredible to think that the diversity of the bacteria that's there, or the density of the bacteria that is there, is the most dense on anywhere in the world. So it's a really good place for bacteria to grow. But it's also a bit selective. We know that there are about 55 different bacterial phyla on the planet, but only about 8 to 12 of those phyla will colonize our intestine. So it is a bit selective because of what we eat. It's interesting that 70% of the bacteria that are in your body are found in the gut, and at the same time, greater than 70% of all your immune cells are found in the gut. So this is an area that the bacteria and your immune system can really have a crosstalk, and they have a conversation all the time to educate each other. Now, colonization starts during the birthing process. So in utero, we're really thought to be in a sterile environment. And then as you're exposed to the external environment, which is teeming with bacteria, you start to get colonized. And as Paul already mentioned, that this is really dictated by your external environment. So your mother's microbiota, how much bathing the newborn baby gets. If you have a lot of bathing, you're going to change the microbiome on the skin, and the food you eat. So how long the baby is breastfed or formula fed, when solid food is introduced, this is all going to have an influence on the microbiome. Now, the immune system of a newborn baby is not fully mature and fully developed at the time of birth. And it absolutely requires signals that come from your microbiota to drive further development and further regulation. So the microbiome really educates this developing immune system. And the idea is that in westernized countries, in these past 30, 40 years, what's been happening is that we're getting cleaner and cleaner. We have a high uses of antibiotics, and we are decreasing the diversity of our normal commensal non-pathogenic bacteria. And the idea is that maybe you're missing some of the microbiota that really gives these educational cues. And this may be one of the things that's really driving this increase in chronic diseases later in life. And the idea is that there may be really a critical window early in life, in the first, so 1 to 3 years of life as a baby is developed, where the immune system is developing. And during this time, there may be this window where the immune system is really permissive to educational cues from the microbiota. And so the idea is that if you don't get proper education during this critical window in life, that you maybe it's going to be too late. Now, this is not going to be the case for everything, but there may be some key things that happen during this time that you really want to have the microbiota there at the right period of time. And experimentally, this has been addressed and has been shown very nicely that there is a critical window in the gut, that you need a certain diversity, and without that, you increase susceptibility to things like allergic disease and asthma and inflammatory bowel disease. In the lungs, this has been shown for an allergy, and in the skin, this has been shown for things like dermatitis and psoriasis. This has been shown very nicely in experimental models, and now we need to look how what really is this window in humans, and what bugs need to be there, and what level of diversity to give this proper education.
Can people get their microbiome tested to find out, or are we
well, there are companies in the States that you can send your microbiome to, and they will test it, but it's for a cost. Other things, I think there are different studies that are out there that you could get tested as a normal control cohort for different studies that you wouldn't have to pay for.
But it sounds like we don't necessarily know what we're looking for.
May I just say that right now there are companies in the business of measuring your microbiome, and they give you your information. And if I were to send you data that says that you've got 1,000 different bacteria, what does that really tell you?
Yeah.
And I think that until they can tell you that you've got the right population of bacteria, I'm not sure you're going to get a lot of information out of it.
Good to know.
Yeah. So we also experimentally decided to ask the question, well, what about, so we know that your microbiota and the microbiota of the baby developing is very important. And then we asked, well, if this critical window is so important, what about the mom's microbiota? Because we know that exposure to antibiotics during the last trimester of pregnancy is an increased risk factor for susceptibility to immune-mediated diseases in the infant. So we wanted to know, well, is that just because the mom's microbiota is different, so the microbiota she gives to newborn is going to be impacted, or could it be something else? And so what we did, we thought, well, maybe that the mom's microbiota could be giving signals to the newborn in utero. So although we know that no live bacteria get in utero, we know that the bacteria make molecules. So these small molecules are called metabolites, and they're able to go into the body. And we know that we can detect them in many, many different places in the body. So we thought, well, maybe these metabolites could get into the uterus and stimulate the baby. So what we did is we developed an experimental system where we could actually look at a transient colonization, so it only happened during pregnancy, so that the newborn didn't have any of its own colonization. And what we found was absolutely astonishing in that the molecules originating from the mom's microbiota were transferred to the baby via the placenta and in the milk. And the mom's antibodies were able to capture these bacterial molecules, and this helped to educate the immune system of the newborn even before it was born. And the benefit of that was that it helped this newborn be ready for its own colonization without responding in an inflammatory way. So you really have to say thanks to your mom, because even during pregnancy, her microbiota is already shaping your immune system. So we have to realize that the microbiota is not just of your own, it's of your mom, and your mom's microbiota is going to be impacted also on her diet and her antibiotic uses and her health status. And so really the take-home message is we need to strengthen our immune system, but we need to do it without destroying our own microbiome, because our microbiome is really our partner in health. It's really important for shaping and developing our immune system.
So if a mom is missing part of her microbiome for whatever reason, because of her mom or whatever, does that, she can't transfer that obviously to the newborn if she doesn't have it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
And is there, I know there's some talk about, well, here you go. I'm going to let you go through this slide.
Okay.
If someone has a question just about this, but let's get the information from you first.
Okay. So there's a lot more research going on into the microbiome and basically what is it doing and what bacteria do we need to have there, how many of these different bacteria, what's their diversity. And the important thing, once we learn all of this, is how can we harness the power of the microbiome? We know the microbiome has an incredible power to educate our immune system, to keep us healthy, so how can we harness it? And what's been happening now is really starting with things like fecal microbial transplantation. And I know everybody's going to say, oh, yuck, because that sounds really horrible. And in the beginning, it really was taking the fecal microbiota and transferring that to somebody who's really in need. And this has been done really effectively now for an infection of a bacteria called Clostridium difficile. You can give back a healthy microbiome, and it really is healing these patients. And the the good thing now is maybe what we should do is make these into a pill, so we don't have to get back a fecal slurry, which is pretty yucky. And what we need to do is now define which bacteria need to be in that pill for certain, whatever situation needs it.
So you could put the right things in the pill to fight certain infections that are antibiotic resistant, or even just period, any infection.
Yeah, any infection or any, we want our population to start off with the most healthy microbiome possible. So maybe we need to start really young and make sure that those first bacteria that you seed in are the right ones and get started on a life of health rather than a life of inflammation. And that's where we really need to do the research and how can we define what is that proper microbiota. And we have to define how can we keep a good, healthy microbiome because, things like diet or antibiotics are really going to impact on that. Here at the University of Calgary, this is one area that we are really, really focusing on because we're developing the Western Canadian Microbiome Centre, where we're really trying to put all the platforms together to enable us to do really the best research on microbiome possible. And the idea is that here at the University of Calgary, we're going to really have a one-stop shop to do everything we need to understand the microbiome. The microbiome itself, sequence it, look at it, how active it is, where it is in different areas of the gut, and also how is it affecting the immune system. We have to be able to really identify and characterize the immune system in different situations.
So we're just getting started with a lot of this research, hey? Like how far out would you say, it's a bit of a guesstimate, I suppose, until we have something like an artificial fecal transplantation or this poop pill, as you mentioned a minute ago?
So the poop pill is already in existence for C. difficile, and now there is a lot of research going on for other things. And it's difficult to give a timeline to it. We hope as quickly as possible. I'm sure in my lifetime this is going to happen, but we need to do some good, solid research. And as we already said, there is a whole plethora of probiotics on the shelf already. And what we need is really solid experimental evidence for which of these are adequate and appropriate for the correct situation.
So can I ask you a few questions now? First of all, both of you have mentioned diet a few times. So what does our microbiome like to eat? What is the preferred diet to keep our microbiome healthy?
Well, so I think that there's some very good research being done that suggests that a diet with lots of fiber actually will fuel and help our microbiome. And so I think fiber first and foremost. If we eat really high protein diets without any of the additional things, that can certainly modify our microbiome. You're now giving permission to other bacteria to grow and to thrive, and that will change the microbiome. So we do need a high fiber diet first and foremost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without getting too complicated, why is the fiber important to the microbiome?
Because the bacteria that is able to break down and use fiber is a bacteria that makes beneficial metabolites for us. That is what we have co-evolved with. And they are the ones that make the molecules that we already know are beneficial to our health, that help to educate our immune system and keep our gut healthy.
Okay, another question someone's asking about hand sanitizer. Paul, what do we think about hand sanitizer? Some people, this person's saying they use it maybe 100 times a day.
Yeah. So, I don't think there's any doubt that if you don't want to transfer flu and various viruses, that keeping your hands clean is probably a reasonable way to prevent yourself from transmitting some of these infections. I think that's everything in reason. I think if you're swabbing your whole body 100 times a day, perhaps you're overdoing it a touch. I think that hand sanitizers, I personally don't use them. I will wash my hands, obviously, but I think that to be using hand sanitizers 100 times a day may be a little bit too much.
What about those products that you find in the grocery store, the drugstore, the antibacterial soaps, the antibacterial everything, it seems? You can just, I mean, what do we think of those products now that we know that bacteria is actually our friend?
Well, I don't have any of them in my home.
Fair enough.
So, of course, we want to keep things clean, and after you go to the bathroom, it's very important that you wash your hands, but we don't want to go overboard. We really don't want to live in a sterile environment. It's not good for our health. There are situations where you need more sterility in a hospital where you're surrounded by people that are immunocompromised and are sick. Their hand sanitizers may play a role when you're going from room to room. But generally in the home, I think we should be a little bit more careful about trying to be so clean.
Another question. Do people, you've said that there's different microbiome on the right hand and the left hand, so I assume that the people from different countries would have different bacteria hanging out with them. What are the implications with that and fighting disease?
Well, let me say, first of all, there's an implication for the research. If we don't do our research, no one else is going to do it for us. And so the Canadian microbiome, the Albertan microbiome, we need to understand it, because whoever asked that question, they're absolutely right. The people in Norway, the people in Africa, the people in Asia will all have different microbiomes. And so for us, we must understand our own microbiome, first and foremost. Secondly, obviously, different infections are prevalent in different parts of the world. And so with travel, there's more transmission and there's more interaction with folks from other countries. But nonetheless, there's still this prevalence in certain countries of certain infections. And so we're doing research that's relevant to Alberta. We're actually taking the next 1,000 babies that are born, and we're going to monitor them and try and understand their microbiome. We're going to follow the moms and try and understand their microbiome, because we think those are the most directly relevant to Canada and to Alberta.
So that study is on the go now?
We're about to start that, right? Yeah.
Oh, and that's here in Calgary or province-wide?
So we're trying to engage Edmonton as well, and perhaps even Lethbridge. Right now we're starting it in Calgary, and we hope to go province-wide.
Do you need people to sign up, or you've got your channels to find?
I think it's just in the process of getting all the paperwork into place, and then I'm sure there will be a call out for volunteers to sign up.
Right. Okay. So we'll watch out for that. And just one more question here. Does the WCMC need microbiome donors? Do you need guinea pigs? Or will you need research subjects as we get going?
We will in the future, as studies go on and are getting funded. Then we may need healthy donors, or we will be looking for different diseases where we want to look at the microbiome compared to healthy controls. And at that point, we will be looking for donors.
We've just managed to get some funding from a philanthropist to study type 2 diabetes, for example, and different diets, and try and understand the difference between eating one kind of diet versus another. And so we're just putting that program together, and we will be calling out for volunteers.
Is there, you were talking a minute ago, we were talking about people from different countries. Is there an ideal global microbiome, given that we live in a society now where you can get on a plane and end up at the end of, across the world? Is there an ideal global microbiome?
We don't know that yet. So there has been some studies that have looked at the microbiome in different populations and then compared them to each other. And the idea has come out that there are certain kind of groups of people with different microbiomes that may span other countries. But right now we don't really know enough to know we can't define what is a healthy normal microbiome, because it varies. But I think we will know that fairly soon.
Yeah, because it would depend on where you live and the things that you do, and the way you spend your day is going to be different than the way I spend my day. Ergo, you're going to need different organisms in there. Very interesting. Does someone is asking that they have lupus, and they're asking if there's any studies that show whether fecal transplants or probiotics can lessen the inflammation and improve symptoms, or are we still a ways away?
I don't know any studies specifically in lupus.
Although as an auto-inflammatory disease, one could imagine that this is one that's associated with the development of the microbiome and the immunobiome. And so one can imagine that they could be associated. But as Kathy says, to my knowledge, there is no study right now looking at lupus.
Is it the sort of topic, though, that there's just more and more research just happening every week, sort of thing? Like it's a very exciting field, hey? Yeah,
and I think more and more clinical people, doctors, are starting to realize that maybe there's something to this, and they're beginning to investigate these areas. So I bet somebody is looking at lupus. We just don't know about it yet.
Okay, another question. We've talked a little bit about eating a lot of fiber and probiotics. Are there other tips for, or the question, what is the best way to rebuild your microbiome?
It's probably really diet, and to rebuild it is to increase the fiber in your diet, and I would say try not to eat a lot of only processed foods. I mean, the best advice is really to eat a healthy diet.
And someone else is asking specifically about yogurt. Is the homemade better than store-bought for our microbiome? Or I guess does that depend on again, those sort of non-processed?
I would suspect it is better, but I don't know of any research that particularly specifically looked at yogurt.
What about another question about cultured fermented foods and how they can affect our microbiome, cabbage, kelp, that sort of thing? What do we know about that?
So this is an area that's actually under intense research, is to look at fermented foods, because fermented foods, there is some evidence that they're used a lot in some countries that have lower incidences of chronic diseases. So there's a lot of research right now to look at if this is healthy for our microbiome. And there are things like we know that some dietary metabolites work really well from broccoli, stuff like that. We know that they have some metabolites in it that the microbiota really like, and they're very healthy for us. But there'll be more and more research into really like functional foods. What foods can we really eat that really promote a healthy microbiome? And that's really where the research is heading.
Superfoods for our superorganism.
Absolutely.
Any research into the addition of chemicals in our food and how that affects our microbiome? Or that's part of what you were just mentioning?
Yes, there is a study that's been published that has shown that emulsifiers in the food can drastically alter the microbiome, and in animal models, this has been associated with increased disease. So yes, processing of food and stuff seems to be something that we're going to need to look at closely.
Someone else is just asking, what do you do, or what if you take your kid with the sniffles to the doctor and the doctor gives you antibiotics and you question whether or not they're needed? I guess you just don't necessarily fill the prescription, or what would you?
So, this is a tough one because every case is going to be different. And if somebody has had the sniffles for 2 weeks, it could be a sinus infection that can only be treated with antibiotics. And so we all depend on good doctors. If your child has had sniffles for a day, put yourself in those shoes and say, would you go to the doctor and get an antibiotic for yourself if sniffles have only been around for a day? So I think that, each case is going to be very different. I think it's, I don't advocate practicing medicine over the webinar, but
you can always ask your doctor, and
yes.
Obviously, if you think that maybe the antibiotics aren't necessary, have that conversation.
Yeah, I would say open a dialogue with the doctor and just ask the questions.
Do we know if there's studies on the effects of alcohol in the microbiome?
This one's close to my heart. And I'm almost certain that obviously ethanol and alcohol are going to be will affect the microbiome. We have 30 different species of bacteria that live in the stomach, and so I'm certain that alcohol will affect that microbiome.
Yeah, but again, we need to know. We don't know all the answers.
We don't know all the answers, but certainly, another chronic disease we shouldn't forget about is cancer. Mm-hmm. And when you affect the microbiome, you then affect the propensity to get cancer, for example. And so, again, everything in moderation. If you're abusing alcohol, obviously that could have a very serious impact on the microbiome.
Kathy, you talked a little bit about that critical window after a baby's born, where the immune system can kind of communicate, the microbiome and the immune system sort of talk to each other and can maybe set up the immune system. How much do we know about that actual time period?
So in babies, we know that the microbiome is still developing from the time of birth to about 3 years of age, where it really starts to stabilize. And that correlates very nicely, basically, when the diet starts to stabilize and the child starts to eat more diet like the adults. So that's really a time of dynamic change. We don't know if the true critical window is in that up to 3 years or if it's shorter. And in human studies, it's much harder to address. So we don't even know right now what exact immune mechanisms are really specific to that critical window, because there is an immune microbiome crosstalk all through life. It doesn't stop after that critical window. It's just a time maybe where the immune system is developing that you need a specific signal in that time. So in humans, we need to work really hard to define what this window is.
Okay. Now, because this research is, as we've just discussed, there's so much of it going on and there's so many discoveries all the time, how does that information get from the lab to the doctor's office?
May I suggest we go to the next slide? And actually what you'll see is that we're trying very hard to disseminate this information. And so, Kathy, maybe. Yeah,
so we have multiple ways as researchers. We publish in scientific journals, and we assume, we know doctors will read these journals and these results, but we also try to come out more to the public and to try to bring our information across. So here we have a book that was written, co-authored by a colleague of ours here at the University of Calgary. This is Dr. Mary Claire Arietta, and this book is really about the microbiome of young children and about raising your children and really saying, let them eat dirt. We should not be living in such a sterile environment. So there are multiple ways that we try to get this out to the public, but also to, of course, to the doctors. And we have a lot, as researchers, we have a lot of dialogue directly with the doctors, and we join, in seminars. We have a lot of discussion ongoing about, what are the needs for the clinician? What do they need to know? What research do we need to do to help to inform them?
Are there special considerations? I mean, this book is a great resource for people raising kids, and the slide you showed earlier, Paul, of someone licking a pig. So that's a great resource. But do we know much about if there's special considerations for people as they get older with their microbiome?
That's a question I get a lot. And so in one of my previous slides, I showed a graph basically of microbiome diversity. So it's very low diversity at the time of birth, and then it goes up to adulthood. And then around the year 60, your microbiome diversity also starts to decline. And this is probably very important for the health as you get older. And right now, we don't know exactly why that decrease in diversity is happening, whether it is change in diet or health, and this is another time where we should look at intervention and see if we can keep a more diverse microbiome that may help in these more elderly years. So this is something that is people are really starting to talk about now, that there may be, really the two spectrums of life are times where the diversity is different, and at times maybe we need to look closely.
What is it about dogs that make them so beneficial to the microbiome?
The studies are actually that any large animal that you live in close proximity with will help to drive a more diverse microbiome. And that's just with, there's a lot of, there's cell wall material from a bacteria that contains a molecule called LPS. And LPS is stimulatory to the immune system. So if you live on a farm, you have more association with cows or pigs or other large animals, you get a health benefit from that. And people that live in the city don't have access to cows, so the larger animals are somebody that you have access to, the dog in your home. So anything like that helps to increase.
And so like, a cat isn't as beneficial as a dog, and I'm not fitting my bias here, people, but is that, so when you say a large animal, it's like this, why wouldn't a cat doesn't have the same effect?
I don't know.
I'm not sure
I'm
that's
not sure.
Okay. All right, there you go, yeah.
I actually was looking some of this up recently, and what I did find was that I think you interact a lot more with the dog, and it's interesting, but couples with a dog tend to have more unifying microbiomes than couples without a dog, and so there's that interaction that the dog almost functions as a vector of your microbiome, and so there is some of these studies going on now.
Interesting. Just another reason to go for a dog. Anyway, now what should pregnant women do to try to keep should they do something special to try to keep their microbiome healthy? You mentioned earlier about the antibiotics. Sometimes women have to take antibiotics when they're pregnant. Are there other things they should try to avoid?
I think the best advice we can give now is to eat healthy, and without, changing your lifestyle. You have to do something that you're going to be able to sustain. So you want a healthy diet and you want to live healthily. And if you need antibiotics, you need to take it. You need to think carefully. You don't want to not take something that's going to put you or your baby under risk. But you should just have an educated reason for taking antibiotics.
Now, earlier on, Paul, you had that long list of conditions that we think are linked to the microbiome, and one of them was obesity. Could you maybe help us understand a little bit how the microbiome might affect obesity?
Well, so there's a very, very interesting clinical case where there was the transfer of the microbiome from someone who was slim to someone who was obese, and that person started losing weight. And so there is the suggestion that perhaps the microbiome that you've developed by eating poorly, by doing something inappropriate, generates a microbiome that now perhaps makes you heavier, makes you gain weight, versus a much more healthy microbiome that actually uses up a lot of the fats and other things and allows you to now perhaps be more healthy. So that's a clinical situation where people have suggested that perhaps the microbiome can dictate your weight.
So many answers that are just lurking, hey? It must be a really exciting field, is it?
It's a very exciting field. I think that we're working in an area that has the potential to have a massive impact on our health. And that really has a potential to stop this drive for increased chronic inflammatory disease in our country, and to basically turn it around and make our population healthy. And we have the potential to do it at so many levels. Let's start off our babies in a healthy way. Start them off on a life of health. Let's look at elderly and see, can we do something that will help to promote their health? Can we actually fix a bad neck bite, especially in somebody who has a chronic disease? We may not cure the disease, but maybe we can help to drive more homeostasis and more health in that individual. So I think we're working in an area that has such a massive potential on such a huge number of people.
Are there, I know we've got some resources on the website here that people can go to find out a little bit more about the research that's happening here, and that with that book that's there on the slide. Would you suggest a journal, or is there a place if someone's really interested to sort of watch this develop in real time kind of thing? Is there a journal or two that you could suggest?
So there's quite a few scientific journals that look really at microbiome, and they're quite academic, so they're written by researchers, for researchers and clinicians, but of course they're open for people to read. But there's also a lot of public press, and The Economist, they often have things on microbiome, but other papers like the Science or Nature will have publications on it, and then there'll be papers that are really about the immune system, immunity, cells, and microbes. These are all journals that try to look very closely at research that's coming out in the field of microbiome and immune system.
And we should just mention, too, that there's a bit of a typo here on this URL. So if you're looking for letthemeatdirt.com, letthemeatdirt.com, not what we have written there. So that's definitely a great resource. Paul, I want to ask you, you showed us a slide earlier that showed, many slides earlier that showed how 1990 things started to, these diseases started increasing. Do you think if we were to come back in 20, 30 years, that this would be the point on those graphs where things start getting better?
Certainly hope so. We've reached epidemic proportions for things like obesity. We do have to do something to change the path. And I think that the scientific community has basically discovered another organ. Imagine if we had just discovered a second brain or a second heart. Everyone would be studying it. And so we have a lot of enthusiasm. I'm not sure the microbiome will explain all diseases. But I think that there's a lot of enthusiasm that we've ignored an organ that actually may regulate a lot of things that help us to be healthy. And so I think that, over the next couple of years, things may turn around and that we may see fewer, for example, allergies, because we're now reintroducing a healthy microbiome to a child who had to take antibiotics. I think that there's a real opportunity here.
Wow, so much information. Thank you guys both very much for coming today and giving us this primer on the microbiome and why you should love your germs. It's been a lot of food for thought, so thank you both very much. And I look forward to hearing, as your research progresses, the other things that you find out. It looks like we've got a lot to learn.
Thank you.
Thank you again, and thank you everybody out there for all your excellent questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them. We'd like to suggest that you go to ucalgary.ca/explore to learn more. We mentioned that there's these resources that you can find on the right of your screen under the resource list. So go there to find out some more stuff. And at the very before you leave us today, we're hoping that you will just take a minute to fill out our very quick little survey that you will also find on the resource list. It just takes a minute, and we would really be appreciative of your feedback. So take a look for that, please. And if you have ideas for other things you want to learn about, other webinars, please just give us a shout at this email address there and give us your thoughts, and we will try to bring them to you. So again, thank you, everybody. And my name is Jennifer Alford, and we'll see you next time.